It was my first summer outside of the Pacific Northwest. I had recently inherited a house from a dead uncle whom I'd never met before. I asked my father about him, and he said that he indeed did have an older brother, but that he hadn't heard from him since before I was born. I decided to say screw it anyways. I packed up my belongings and moved down to New Orleans to stay in my newly acquired home. I had planned on getting it in shape to sell it in the open market. I definitely was not suited for life in the South. The house was pretty nice, maybe a bit upkept, but nice. It sat on about an acre of land. It was 2 stories, and a lot of the appliances were still fairly new. With just a few coats of paint, some cleaning, and a bit of yard work, the place looked good as new. I only had one problem: the bug infestation. I first noticed it around the front porch, a little black line of ants, all walking single file towards a crack between the wall and the concrete patio. I stared at them for a while. Each one carried a small contribution to their community. I remembered my mother telling me about how you must get rid of the ants in your home, as they will only grow in numbers, and soon become overwhelming. If you don't nip it in the bud, you'll have to hire an exterminator, which isn't cheap. So I went out and bought a can of Raid and some sealing putty. I sprayed the can into the opening and sealed the crack, creating their tomb. The next morning I woke up and walked downstairs into the kitchen. I walked over to the coffee pot when I felt a tickle on the top of my bare foot. Another little black line of ants walking single file towards the gap under the fridge. "All right, you little pests," I said out loud, grabbing the can of Raid. I emptied the remainder of the can into the crevice underneath the fridge. I know that ants are attracted to food debris left out, so I deep cleaned the entire kitchen. Not a single nook or cranny was left untouched. And in the process of cleaning, I came across an old stack of newspapers that must have belonged to my uncle. Now, this was strange. Almost every article involved the disappearances of children in New Orleans before the early 2000s, leading all the way up till this last year. I wondered why he'd kept all of these newspapers. Maybe he had an interest in the disappearances? I didn't know of my uncle's occupation. Maybe he was a private investigator. I called my dad for some answers. "Hey, Dad, what did Uncle Don do for a living?" I asked. There was a moment of hesitation. Why do you ask?" "Well, I found a collection of newspapers that all seemed relevant to one another. I was just hoping to connect the dots and find out why he kept them all for all these years." Another long pause. "Well, my brother was always kind of weird. I wouldn't think on it too much. When I was a kid, I'd always ask if I could go out and play with him in the woods, but he always shot me down. That's all I could really remember before he joined the army. I was really young." My dad then paused awkwardly, as if there was more to the story. Something else that he wanted to tell me. He eventually continued by saying, "He flew out when you were born and stayed the night with us. He never said much, but at that time he stayed in the guest room. I remember walking past his room to get something for your mother when I heard his voice coming from the other side of the door. He was talking to himself. I couldn't tell you what he said since he was whispering, but I remember it making me feel really uncomfortable. We asked him to leave the next morning because all he did was stay in the room and occasionally come out. to watch you sleep. I hadn't heard from him since. That story from my father didn't relieve my curiosity one single bit. I looked into the events via Google and discovered that each one of the missing children had never been found, as well as the fact that they were all exactly 6 months apart. I checked out every single occurrence, and not once did I find a break in the cycle. As I was typing, a large, black spider darted across the top of my hand. I freaked out and grabbed a newspaper and made an attempt to swat the thing. I chased it around the room and into the hall. The 8-legged creep bolted down the hall and under the crack of the hallway door. Gotcha. I swung the door open, only to find about 9 more of his little friends. That was when I made the decision to call the exterminator. Things were way out of control. He came down and gave me an estimate after explaining to him the situation and taking a brief look around. Easily 800. That may be subject to change depending on what we find further along the way. I'll contact you in about a week. Damn, 800? That was something that I really couldn't afford right now. But if I wanted to sell this place, I needed to get it done. So I agreed. That night, I was having a bit of trouble getting to sleep. I kept wondering if I'd be mauled by spiders when I least expected it, or carried away by an army of ants. I got up and headed down to the kitchen to get a drink, pulling the shot glass and bottle of whiskey from the cabinet. I felt a familiar tickle on the top of my foot. I looked down, and in the light of the moon shining through my kitchen window, a tiny black line crossed over the top of my bare foot. Damn it, I shouted. I was so startled that I knocked the bottle of whiskey from the counter, and it fell to the floor, breaking and spilling liquor all over the linoleum. I was reaching to the side of the fridge where I kept the mop when I noticed the trail of ants didn't lead to the same location as before. Something in me suggested that I follow them, which I did, and they led me to the pantry doors. I opened them to see that they disappeared behind a stack of tote bins stacked below the pantry shelving. I think I just found your base. Take me to your queen, I said mockingly. I pushed the totes aside. Surprised would be putting it lightly when I saw what was behind them. A small door, painted to blend in with the walls surrounding it. The ants squeezed through the small crack where the paint had started to chip away. I pried at the door, and after a bit of effort, I managed to get it open. A horrific odor emanated from the confines of the hole. I ran to the garage and grabbed an old flashlight and returned to the hole, this time with shoes on. I plugged my nose and crawled on my hands and knees into the dark opening. It was only a few feet forward, leading into another gap that opened up into a larger room. There was nothing in the room other than spiderwebs and dust. But in the center of the floor was a wooden door. The handle had a padlock attached to it, but luckily, or possibly the opposite of luck, it wasn't fully engaged, since I only had to tug on it for it to unlatch. The door was heavy and well reinforced. I found the whole thing strange, because I knew that most of New Orleans was practically below sea level, and basements were nearly non-existent. Behind the trapdoor was a ladder. I don't know what level of stupidity had consumed me at this time, but I felt that it was necessary to continue. Holding the flashlight between my teeth, I descend the rickety wood ladder into the dark depths below. I was only a few feet past the entrance when a rotten plank gave way under the weight of my foot. I lost my grip and plummeted down into the darkness. I hit the ground hard, knocking the wind out of me. The flashlight hit the ground with an equal force and went out, leaving me in the shadows with no source of light. I caught my breath and crawled over to the flashlight. It took a few steady whacks from the palm of my hand to get it to turn on again. And just in that moment, I noticed that the floor seemed to move below me. I shined the light at the ground. At first it looked as if the floor had come to life, but I soon realized that the entirety of the basement floor was covered in bugs. I violently kicked around as they crawled up my legs. Something fell on the top of my head. A spider. It was nearly the size of my hand. I screamed and frantically swiped at my head, knocking the spider out of my hair. And that's when my light shined on something, curled up against the wall. My heart began to pound even harder against my chest. I completely forgot about the bugs covering the floor as I stepped closer to the figure. I wish I was prepared for the gruesome sight I had discovered. It was the body of a child, cruelly mutilated and shackled to a hook protruding from the wall. Thousands of tiny chunks of dead skin had been taken from the little boy's flesh. I turned and vomited all over the insect-covered floor. The smell finally hit me. It was something I could never describe with words. I shined my light around the room, only to find more corpses. Most of the bodies were unidentifiable, as they'd been trapped down there for longer than I could imagine. Some of the bodies had been stripped clean of their muscle and flesh, leaving only piles of bones to remain. And suddenly, I felt a sharp pinch on the back of my neck, then on my legs, then my hands. Soon my entire body was being devoured by the spiders and ants that dwelled inside that dungeon. I thrashed around and tried to get as many of them off of me while retreating back to the ladder. It felt like the longest moment of my life as I ascended that ladder and slammed the basement door shut. I crawled through the hole and lunged through the opening that led into my kitchen. The bugs continued to gnaw at my skin, and each time I felt a pinch, I'd knock them to the floor, but they'd just come back at me again. I crashed through the back door and out into the yard. I watched in terror as every one of the bugs leapt off of me and scurried towards the house as fast as they could. There was no way in hell that I'd ever enter that house again, so I walked to the neighbors, which was easily a mile away, and used their phone to call the police. The neighbors didn't allow me inside to wait for the officers to arrive. They stayed inside and locked their doors. Honestly, I didn't blame them. I was covered in blood, and my skin had hundreds of tiny bite marks. I looked like hell. When the police arrived, they immediately called an ambulance. I nearly threw a fit when they cuffed me to the gurney and wheeled me into the back of the truck. They questioned me at the hospital, and fortunately, they believed me. I did have an alibi leading up to the events, since none of the bodies recovered were from within the past few days. The state seized the property, which wasn't a big deal, since I doubt I was going to be able to sell the place anyways. I ended up moving back to Washington State, and I'm attending regular counseling due to the level of trauma I experienced. Lately, I've been having a hard time sleeping at night. I think about why my uncle did those horrible things to those children. And the worst part of it all, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I could swear I would see those little, black, single-file lines crossing over the foot of my bed.